So in the population that I work with and apply my work to, which is primarily yoga teachers, healthcare professionals, and yoga therapists who are full of compassion to take the tool of yoga and apply it to those who are suffering from a diagnosis of cancer. The element that I try to deal with is that there is a assumption that they might connect to an if they are not a survivor themselves and have not been on this journey, that they are going to understand what it's like to suffer from these very aggressive treatments in order to save their lives. And that's usually a projection on the part of the therapist or the healthcare professional of as what that cancer survivor is actually gone through or is going through. So they need to be trauma informed of what it feels like to be told you have cancer, trauma informed of what treatments plans they will be put on, trauma informed of the emotional, physical, and psychological impact of those treatments, and the potential that there will be lifelong, there'll be short-term side effects that are very manageable. There'll be many and almost all with lifelong side effects that have to be daily managed. So that's where the trauma comes from. It's from an ongoing process of knowing what that path is, the treatments, and that they're left with a stigma of constantly having to deal with the fact that they may experience that trauma again at any point, which is probably a little different than someone who's in prison, who is hopefully not going to experience what got them there in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting when I think about what does it mean to be trauma informed. I kind of look back over the last 20 years of the work that I've done, and I realized that in the beginning, I wasn't familiar with the term trauma. And it wasn't until I actually did some training with Yoga for Veterans, where I went through a training with mindful yoga therapy around how active military people were impacted by trauma. And I sat back and I realized, well, a lot of the people that I work with, in fact, most of the people that I work with who are incarcerated, are dealing with the same kind of symptoms. That the brain doesn't distinguish between, well, I have symptoms of trauma from active duty in the military to symptoms of trauma from having lived a criminal lifestyle. The brain only gets trauma. And that led me to go to school on trauma, to really have a deeper understanding of trauma and to study trauma. And my main teacher has been Bessel van der Kolk in understanding the different types of trauma: developmental trauma, complex trauma, intergenerational trauma, and very importantly, my own trauma. And that being exposed to trauma gave me the opportunity to identify the trauma that I've experienced in my own life. Maybe not as severe as the people that I've worked with, but really being able to identify, oh yeah, I've experienced trauma. And that trauma that I experienced was developmental trauma. And that trauma that I experienced was secondary trauma. And the other thing that I really realize about understanding trauma is that it's constantly, our understanding of trauma is constantly evolving. And as more research is being done, as more identification of how trauma impacts a person and their behavior and their lives, it just keeps opening up for me a deeper understanding of what it really means to be trauma informed.
I would say you hit on something that is really important in the work that I do, training other yoga teachers and therapists and healthcare professionals to deliver yoga to cancer patients and survivors, and that is the awareness of your own trauma that you have inside of yourself, the knowledge you have or the lack of knowledge that you have yourself of what this experience is. I mean, you're not incarcerated, so understanding what that experience was involves really getting into finding ways to understand. I forget what philosopher used this term, but the other, and that's what the goal and the work is for a yoga teacher or therapist, to take on the other and letting aside your own personal stuff but you have to before you can leave it behind, your own personal stuff, you have to really do the work that you did. I think that's really important. And then I think too, the word trauma, you're right. It's an ongoing quest to figure out what is this word trauma? I mean, it's kind of it's not new, but our attention to it recently has been new. And I'm not sure I understand it yet either. But it is an important, well, I mean, I can only project the trauma that others have when they go through cancer based on my experience. But I have a huge gap of understanding and knowledge when I think about the trauma of war victims and trauma of a domestic violence victim. I have a huge gap in my an understanding of how to process my compassion for those under those circumstances. So you're right. It's an ongoing thing. We will never really, I don't want to put a label on what is trauma. I think if anything.
I think particularly I see this with new facilitators that we bring in who don't have the experience of having worked with incarcerated people, that you can come to one of our yoga classes that's usually led by somebody who's experienced, and the new person will go out and say, gee, these people don't seem traumatized. That was a really great yoga class. And how important it is to have the understanding of the layers of trauma underneath the surface of anybody's life and anybody's current state, that underneath that are layers that go back to the issues of developmental trauma, complex trauma, in some cases intergenerational trauma, the trauma that they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. It's as if people who are experiencing trauma are, what are you talking about? This is my life. And so it's really important for us who are facilitators of these programs to understand the backgrounds of trauma that these folks come from, and to be able to orient our services toward that kind of a background.
Because they are survivors, and to be a survivor means to learn how to deal with the chaos and to not bring the affect of all of that to your daily life.
Right.